Welcome to Santapod Raceway, a world-famous drag racing strip that was the first of its type in Europe. Today it's a venue that attracts visitors from all over with its various car shows and race events, and on certain days you can witness top fuel dragsters tearing up the strip at 300 miles per hour. But what of this legendary race venue? What's its story and how did it come to be? Today we're going to find out. It all starts with a field in a place called Poddington, found in Bedfordshire. The area was nothing more than an expanse of farmland until, that is, some guy called Hitler decided to be a bit of a dick, resulting in us needing to construct a vast array of military infrastructure with some vigour. Over the course of only a few years, hundreds of military sites and airfields would be built out of necessity, and it led to the construction of an airfield on our farmers' fields in Poddington. Given the situation, I'm sure the farmers wouldn't have minded, but it's not like they would have had a choice. The Air Force wanted an airfield to be built here, so it would be. Construction would start in 1940, and after 2 years it was ready to accept its first aircraft. Over the next few years, the airfield was mostly used by the United States Army Air Force and would be home to various bomber squadrons, which eventually created a bit of an issue because the aircraft were becoming increasingly larger, and with the arrival of the B-17, RAF Poddington needed its runways extending to accommodate the new aircraft. A tragic loss of life would occur in 1944 during the takeoff stages of a mission to France. 36 B-17 aircraft were scheduled to fly from RAF Poddington in groups of 12, and the way they orchestrated the takeoff was fairly simple. The planes would line up, and after the first plane departs, the next in line starts a stopwatch to count 30 seconds before they then depart, and so on throughout all 36 aircraft. The problem was, on this day, there was fog so thick there was zero visibility. Today we'd close Heathrow for at least a week, but back then this was just something you had to deal with. The first 18 aircraft took off without issue, but Lieutenant Jack Pearl's aircraft experienced an issue with its tail wheel on takeoff, leading it to veer off the runway and crash, killing all on board. Of course, only a matter of seconds behind this was another B-17 starting its takeoff, but fortunately it saw that there was an issue and aborted the takeoff safely. This B-17 then turned around on the runway to head back towards the starting point, but unfortunately, because of the poor visibility, wasn't spotted by the next aircraft in line to depart, and as it thundered down the runway, the two aircraft collided. With these planes being fully loaded up for a bombing raid in Europe, you can only imagine the scenes that would unfold. By 1945, when things had all calmed down a bit, the United States Army Air Force moved out of RAF Poddington and it was handed back over to the Air Ministry, basically the management team for the RAF, and the site was mostly used for storage. For 15 years, the Ministry of Defence deployed personnel to the airfield to guard a highly treasured cargo, millions of sandbags. This was questioned by an MP in the early 1960s because why did they need to spend a chunk of the budget on defending some sandbags? It led to an investigation, and something must have been amiss because the site was put up for sale shortly after. The new owner's plan was to demolish and remove the airfield buildings and runways, which they mostly did. However, before the main runway was churned up into aggregate, a group of local racing enthusiasts approached the owners looking to use the runway as a drag strip, and amazingly they agreed. It took a couple of years of paperwork and whatnot, but in 1966 Santapod Raceway would open for business. Have you ever wondered what the deal is with the name Santapod? It's a combination of two things. The Santa part is named after Santa Ana Drags, the first drag strip in the United States, which would open in 1950. The pod part comes from the nearby village of Poddington and the fact that the venue is built on RAF Poddington, so now you know. When Santapod first opened, it was actually arranged a little differently to how we know it. The start line for races used to be where today's finish line is, and the pit area extended backwards from the start line along what's used today as the main drag strip. It wouldn't be until 1968 that the drag strip took on the shape and layout that we're familiar with today. That setup comprises a simple quarter-mile drag strip with the start line at the end of what used to be the main runway. After the finish line, you've got about a half a mile of runway or track remaining, and if you don't stop in time, you'll end up in a field and possibly take out a wind turbine. In 2017, the original track and runway was torn up and replaced with a more modern surface and foundation. It allowed for better water drainage and thus quicker track drying times, which is useful because it always rains in England. Santapod puts on around 70 to 80 events per year and typically sees around 400 to 500,000 visitors a year. A particular highlight of events is when they run the top fuel dragsters or the jet engine car. Interestingly, the first jet-powered car would arrive to run at Santapod in the early 1970s. It was brought over from Sweden by a crazy guy known as Arnold Sundqvist, and his car was called Silver Streak, and to say it looked janky is a bit of an understatement. It utilised a J46 Westinghouse engine, an afterburning gas turbine engine developed for the US Navy in the 1950s. It could generate 5,800 pounds of thrust. I don't really know how to quantify that, but suffice to say it's a lot for a car. It would accelerate Arnold down Centre Pod Raceway in around 8 seconds, achieving speeds of 200 miles an hour. That's not bad for the early 1970s, and in fact, the car did run to 250 miles an hour, but that was at a different venue, and Arnold sort of crashed. He was fine though. Today, Centerpod runs Fire Force 5, a jet engine car that can achieve over 300 miles an hour in a quarter-mile run. This still falls a bit short of the track record set in 1984, which is a quarter-mile time of 3.58 seconds at 386.26 miles an hour, a record held by American Sammy Miller in his rocket car known as Vanishing Point. The next best effort comes from Fire Force 3, which in 2005 managed 336 miles an hour, but that's the closest anyone's ever got to beating Sammy. In 2018, Bedfordshire Council announced that it was working with property developers with a view of constructing 4,500 houses next to Centerpod Raceway as part of a massive garden village project. As we all know, when you build houses next to a racetrack that's existed without any problems for decades, it isn't long before noise complaints start to flood in and the track is forced to close because people didn't have the foresight to notice that the overpriced garbage new-built house that they bought is located next to a racetrack. However, and to be honest, this is the only reason for sharing this story, in a rare case, perhaps the only case of a council applying common sense to a situation resulted in the plans being withdrawn. The Centerpod owners and property developers couldn't resolve the issue of existing noise, so rather than everyone kick up a fuss, they withdrew the plan to build the garden village. What this means is that Centerpod Raceway still thrives to this very day, attracting drivers and spectators from all over the world, cementing its position as one of the world's finest drag racing venues, and long may it continue. Thanks for watching.